Earl Williams came to Fairfax County from Texas and created and grew a firm called BDM, Braddock Dunn and McDonald. It was the first true large business in Fairfax County and the first government contractor that we had in this community. But Earl didn't hold himself just to the business. He became the chairman of the Economic Development Authority. He sat on boards, and he motivated the county and prodded the county into doing the right things, and the business community grew as a result.
I moved here in 1970 because we were moving the headquarters from El Paso, Texas up here. It was a technical professional services firm, later in public relations parlance up here, known as one of the first Beltway bandits. We always refer to ourselves as Parkway Patriots. But again, these are the things, people see things in different lights. I had absolutely no intention whatsoever of getting into politics. I helped form a community college in El Paso, and that was the extent of my involvement in the electoral process. And for the next 5 years, I was involved deeply in trying to build the company into something, a powerhouse. $7 million we had at that point. Can't build a powerhouse much out of that. So I was very deeply involved in that and really wasn't paying any attention to Fairfax County politics, Virginia politics. One of my vice presidents came in one day and says, you need to come down to the Chamber of Commerce and meet a guy named Jack Harrity. Why do I need to go down to the Chamber of Commerce and meet Jack Harrity? Well, because he's running for the chairmanship of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, and the business community ought to be behind him, but they're sort of falling away because this woman who was the incumbent got a lot of support. She was one of the Greens, one of the anti-business people. And we need to get somebody from the tech community down and to work with Jack. So I went reluctantly, and we had lunch. And the next thing I know, the board had formed this so-called Norman Cole Committee, the Blue Ribbon Committee. You may have heard about the committed to study the means of improving industrial development in Fairfax County, headed by Norman Cole. It was on that committee that I first met Till and some of the other people that I worked with subsequently. We came up with some recommendations about what could be done to improve industrial development. That was the way they categorized it. And I was picked to make that presentation to the Board of Supervisors. I did make it, and it was reasonably well received. We had tried to patronize, I guess you would say, the Board of Supervisors, trying to get their support. And one of the recommendations in the report was that the Board of Supervisors needed to take a more proactive part in selling Fairfax County. And that I said, if you people can do that, we'll get the television cameras in here, and you can help us sell, and we're all going to have, live happily ever after type thing. Had my 3 minutes. I turned around and I walked to the back of the room, and Till was standing there with his hands folded, standing there. And as I walked by him, he says, I didn't know your middle name was Pollyanna. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't, because what we told the Board of Supervisors that night came true. As a result of that presentation, I got appointed to the Economic Development Authority. And when Jack asked me to go on the authority, I turned him down because I'd done enough research to know that at that time, believe it or not, folks, the Economic Development Authority was a wine and cheese party. The members would come to the board meetings on Monday night or whatever it was, collect their checks. That's not what made it worthwhile, believe me. Have their wine and cheese and go home. And no interest in economic development whatsoever, as far as I could tell. And Jack says, I said, I'm not going to go on anything where I can't make a difference. And he said, well, that's what I want you to do. And I said, well, all right, if that's what you want to do, I'll do it. So I did, and after the first 2 meetings, this guy named Lee Shure, who was the marketing guy out at Gulf Crescent, grabbed me and says, let's go have a beer. So we did, and he said, you don't look happy. He says, 2 meetings I've seen you, you don't look happy. What's the problem? And I said, I'm not going to sit here and go through this nonsense. And he said, well, I feel the same way about it. And he says, at presentation to the board, basically the board said they approved of all the things that the Norman Cole Committee had recommended, including the possibility of increasing the budget for EDA. He says, why don't we go back in and tell the EDA board that we want to see a shift in concentration here, and we want to go back and ask the Board of Supervisors for what was then a monumental increase in the budget. So we went back into the next meeting, and we did just that. We said, we have met, and we believe that the board can be more useful, more helpful, provide more guidance to the Board of Supervisors if we go back in and tell them what we need to make this thing happen. At that time, the business industrial portion of the real estate tax was down around 16% and dropping. And people were very concerned about that. You could turn into a Newark here if you have all services and no tax base. So we did, and what do you know? At the end of the board meeting, they had approved the budget approved. Now, I had some opposition. I made the comment that what the plan was, if they approved that budget, that we would take the business industrial portion of the tax base from the current 16% up to 25% in 10 years. Actually, in the next few years, it dropped down to something closer to 12%, but it did turn around. One of the ladies, members sitting on the board, when I finished, said, well, Mr. Williams, that's all very well, but what you propose is mathematically impossible. And I said, no, Mrs. Moore, it is not mathematically impossible. It will be very difficult, and we're not making any guarantees. We're not promising we can do that, but I'll tell you one thing for sure. If we don't shoot for that, we will not make it. That's the one thing I can promise you. When it was over, they approved that, and just sort of jump ahead a little bit. 10 years later, the business industry portion of the tax was 27%. So we exceeded what we had said we could do. I didn't know much about George Mason University. That's not. I didn't know anything at all about George Mason University. I thought it was still a junior college. Really, that's how out of it I was. One day, though, I was sitting in an organizational meeting. I think Chamber of Commerce. I think I'm not really sure, but George Johnson was the speaker. That's the thing I remember. We had never met, and when the speech was over, I was standing wondering whether I should go up and introduce myself. When I looked up, and he was headed for me. And he said, you know, I'm the speaker. I was George Johnson, but you're Earl Williams, right? And I said, yeah, that's right. He said, well, you're head of the Economic Development Authority, right? And I said, yes, sir, that's right. And he said, well, what would you think about having a university here in Northern Virginia that made common cause with the business community, a symbiotic relationship in which the business community will support George Mason University, and George Mason University will support the business community in whatever it needs in a 4-year university. I said, man, that sounds like the glory road. And he said, well, why don't we do it? And that was George. Why don't we do it? And I said, well, let's do it. And we did. And that's how that first connection between the tech community and George Mason came about, purely by accident. It developed into a lot more. George was so good at politics and going around all over the state and meeting all of these people. There wasn't much of a tech community here at the time, actually, and that's why I ended up taking the leadership role that I did. There was a vacuum, and I filled the vacuum. In 1994, I think it was, Regardie's magazine, now defunct, had a very long article in there entitled, I say, The Revolution at George Mason University. And it was the story of basically George and Till and me, referred to us as the Gang of Three, and outlined the things that we had done, were doing, including some of the controversial things that we had done, which gave us a little increased visibility. Not all that visibility was good, because more people then began to attack you when they find out you're trying to do something progressive. I'm using terms of progressive in terms of moving forward, not as a political term, because most of the people there were not political progressives. Certainly I wasn't, certainly Till wasn't. But anyway, we started dealing with the people downstate. We put together an organization to bring the legislators up to Virginia and tour them around on a weekend on buses so that we could show them what was up here. People downstate had an almost totally misguided conception of what was going on up here. And so the first thing we had to do was get them acquainted with the facts. And that worked well. And George Johnson began to have a series of meetings at his house at the university. Joanne would cook dinner, and we would have dinner there and bring up some of the key people from the legislature. And we formed a number of groups. We had the Industrial Advisory Board. We had in the Round Table. The 1-2-3 Club was formed out of that group, not under one. And the point of 1-2-3 Club, which you may or may not have heard of, was purely to support George Mason University. That's all it was at the time. Very, very simple. And we named it the 1-2-3 Club because the enemy we were fighting in our minds was the crowd in Richmond, which was controlling politics in the state at the time. And the code name or the common name for those people was Main Street. And people would refer to the Main Street crowd in Richmond. The Main Street crowd ran Virginia. So we thought, what can we name our group? And sort of maybe take off with that. So what is the main street that runs by George Mason University? Route 123. So we said, we'll name our club the 123 Club. And from here on out, it's the 1-2-3 Club against Main Street. And you know, the Washington Post decided that this was some kind of a conspiracy. And they wrote articles about the 1-2-3 Club. And these important people who were making all these decisions about, you know, the public didn't know what they were making, and yada, yada. We got fed up with it. So we invited the Post to send over one of the editors to come to one of our meetings. And we had a regular meeting. And when we got done, we said to the guy from the Post, what questions do you have? What do you want to know? And he asked a few pertinent, appropriate questions, and we answered them. And that's the last publicity we ever got from the Washington Post. And to this very day, though, there are the people who wonder what it's all about. It's just a group of people who got together and tried to decide what direction the county might be going in. And by the way, 1-2-3 Club never took a position publicly on any subject. The work was done by the individuals. We'd have meetings and we would decide what needed to be done. And people would say, I'll do this, I'll call that guy, I'll call the other guy, and we would all go out and we would call. And I think it's true of everybody, it was certainly true of me. I never called anybody and said, the 1-2-3 Club believes this. I said, hey, I'm Earl Williams, I got a company, I'm dealing with a lot of other people, we have problems up here, and I'd like to talk with you about the problems and see if you can't help us. And that approach works. It really did. That worked. We began to be looked at as people, not these bad Yankees from Northern Virginia. Things rocked along there for a while, and what we had been doing began to take. We began to have companies inquiring. We began to have companies moving into here. I began to get some flack in my own company because what in the world was I doing, spending time going out trying to attract companies here to Fairfax County that were going to be our competitors? And, you know, that's a point of view that people have about this sort of thing sometimes. My view was the more the merrier. It was like George Johnson feeling about the universities that were coming in here from other places. More the merrier. The more universities we have in here, the more colleges, the better off we will all be. And I said, the more companies that we have come in here, spread it around, we can increase our impact in the technology community. We'll be sharing ideas. We'll have more clout getting money for George Mason University. And that's the way it went. There was a vacuum in leadership. That's the key difference between what we were dealing with and what you all are dealing with. I made the statement to George Johnson one time. I said, George, if this was Philadelphia, no one would ever have heard of me. And I'm very serious about that. Because the point was, I got the prominence. I'm sitting here right now because of the things that I did, because there was nobody else to do it. And that's true of these other people sitting here too. We did things because nobody else was willing to step forward and do it. And I was so prominent in some of the presentations that people decided that I was a developer and they wanted to know what my land developments were. I met a lot of people. We covered a lot of ground. We brought a lot of companies in here. EDA has done a great job. The advertising has been great. Now, many of the things that we fought for have come true. It comes with it a price. the congestion, the high rises, the problems that you have, but not all of these are local problems. The problems we're having in our schools today, and he showed you the composition of the schools population, of the county population. We didn't have those kind of schools at the time. You were working with a more homogeneous set of people. Not true anymore. And the worst thing about it is that the people coming here now, as good as that is, as great as it is, they're bringing the business, that they're bringing people in here, they think this all was just handed to somebody on a silver platter. They look around and they see all this and say, wow, isn't this great? I think I'll move that company there. And you go to them and you say, how about getting involved in the chamber? Oh, I don't have time. How about getting involved in politics? I don't have time. And that's what you run into. A company moved here, a big company, while I was still on EDA. It was a satellite company. Boy, the kind of thing we really like to get in. So I went over to meet the president of the company and introduced myself, told him why I was there, told him what I did in real life, and that it's very important to him to become an active part of Fairfax County. He said, well, Mr. Williams, I appreciate what you're doing, and I put up all those things that you've done. Good, that's fine. But I am a citizen of the greater metropolitan Washington area. That's the way I see myself. I said, well, sir, this is not the first time I've heard that. But I said, I want to tell you the same thing I've told the other people that said that to me. When somebody breaks into your building some night and steals some of your stuff, don't bother calling the Metropolitan Washington Area Police Force the next morning, because they're not coming. When your building catches on fire, don't bother calling the Washington Metropolitan Fire Department, because they're not coming. And when your employees complain about the library system, don't call the Metropolitan Washington Library System, because they're not coming. And I said, I appreciate very much your organization being here. I'm glad you located it in Fairfax County, and I hope to see you again, and I got up and left. There's nothing you can do with people like that. And we got people here this very day, who will tell you that they are citizens of the Washington metropolitan area. At that time, that was really bad news for people of us trying to bring technologists into the county, because Washington, D.C. had a very bad reputation. More than one time, we had to deal with the wives of people we were trying to recruit and convince them that they could move to the Washington area, but they only were moving to Northern Virginia, and we didn't have the problems. We didn't have the crime problems. We didn't have the school problems. We didn't have any of the problems that D.C. had. This was a different organization, a different entity altogether, and that generally worked. I retired from the company in 1992 and have found myself involved in politics and dealing with technology companies, still trying to convince people that this is a great place to do business. It's going to do a better place to do business. And I hope that all of you, because you're a lot younger than I am, I hope all of you and your children are going to prosper, do well, and be able to stay in Fairfax County with a good job and not have to move off to Colorado or California or Massachusetts in order to make a living. That was the dream, that we could build a community here, that people could stay here. We would have a university, a good university at our center, and all of it worked. Alan Merton came in and followed George Johnson and did a good job with moving it along. Bob Templin, Bell Wheeling, and then Bob Templin followed on Dick Ernst's steps. All of this has moved forward. By the way, I told you that the thing that George and Dick did, which was different at the time. At that time, the community college system and the university systems were not talking very much to each other. Each of them saw themselves as having a different mission. George and Dick put together a plan and a curriculum set in which, if you go to Northern Virginia Community College and get an associate's degree, if you have a certain grade average, you are guaranteed admission into George Mason University. Now, maybe that doesn't sound very important to you, but believe you me, that's big. because this way we can get people who ought not to be going into George Mason in the first 2 years, late bloomers and people who can't afford it, to go to Northern Virginia Community College without feeling this is a low-rated institution that they're going to be looked down on by their peers because they're going to Nova. We've changed that. And people have gone on. I mean, it's not a tidal wave, but it's a movement out of Northern Virginia Community College into George Mason today, and it's adopted statewide. One of the greatest things that ever happened. And by the way, just a plug for myself, too. I was on the Virginia State Board for Community Colleges for 7 years, appointed first by a Republican governor and then reappointed by a Democratic governor. One of the highlights of my life to see all over the state what was being done with the community college system. It's the gem of the Virginia educational system. Any chance you get to support it, you ought to do it. It's a good thing. I'm done. Thank you.